Welcome to the third week in our series called A Rising Tide as we look together at the scary subject of accountability. Now, in the first week, we looked at this idea that we have a God who is accountable, who holds himself accountable, and in fact, who holds himself accountable not only for his own actions, but for our actions as well, our own failings as well. In fact, Jesus on the cross is the ultimate example of accountability as he becomes accountable for our mistakes. Now, last week we looked at this idea that God has given us the gift of each other. And so we can be fully known and truly loved, not only by God, but by one another in God's family as well. And today, we're going to take a look at the concept of leadership and accountability. But first, I have a picture for you. Take a look at this picture. Cute kid, huh? Yeah, that's actually me. That's me when I was about 5 years old, I think. And I was a pretty cute kid. But if you talk to my parents, they will tell you I was also a little bit of a handful. I remember one story my mom used to tell that came from about the same time as that picture. I was playing with something and she wanted me to do something different. And so she told me to do it and I basically ignored her. And then she told me a second time to do it and I ignored her again. Finally, she kind of got in my face and made it clear that if I didn't do what she was telling me to do, there was going to be consequences. And supposedly, I trust my mom that this is what happened. I don't remember it. I put my hands on my hips and I looked at her and I said, "You are not the boss of me." She made it clear to me that she was. Now, I tell you that story because I think there's a little piece in all of us that doesn't like to know that we have a boss, doesn't like to know that we have somebody who is our leader, who is leading us. We rebel against leadership. We rebel against authority. That's why God in his commandments, the fourth commandment says this. It says that we're supposed to honor our father and our mother, honor our parents. That's in Exodus 20, verse 12. And Martin Luther, writing about that commandment, kind of revealed the underlying principle that's there when he said this: we should fear and love God so that we do not despise or anger our parents or other authorities, but honor them, serve and obey them, love and cherish them. See, there's a principle that underlies this commandment about honoring our parents, is that God has given us people who lead us, people who are in authority over us. It's the way life is supposed to work. Now, I want to talk this week with you about three things that relate to this idea of leadership and accountability. And the first one is, let's talk a little bit about how leaders in God's family, how spiritual leaders are supposed to lead. There's this story in Mark chapter 10 where two of Jesus' disciples, they were brothers, James and John, came to Jesus and they had a question for Jesus. And the question was this: they said, "Jesus, when you come into your kingdom," in other words, when you establish your leadership in your kingdom, they were asking, "can we sit on your left and on your right?" See, what they were picturing here is Jesus sitting on a throne and being in charge and leading, and all kinds of subjects or people coming before Jesus with concerns, with questions, with problems, and Jesus being the one who was kind of in charge, solving all those problems, of making rulings on how things were supposed to happen, being the boss, so to speak. And James and John said, "We want to be sitting on either side. We want to be your trusted advisors. We want to have positions of authority and respect as well." Now, as you can imagine, Jesus had an interesting response to them on that. He said, first of all, well, it's not up to you to decide who's going to be on my left and on my right when I come into my kingdom. Remember that. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. But then Jesus had something to teach them about what leadership in God's family is all about. You see, the other disciples had heard that they asked this question, and they weren't very happy. They're like, "Well, what makes you guys special? What about us?" And so Jesus gathered them all together. And in Mark chapter 10, we read this. He said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, leaders, lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you." Jesus said this. He said, "Instead, whoever wants to become great among you, whoever wants to be great in the family of God, must be your servant," Jesus said. And then he concluded with this. He said, for even the Son of Man, he's talking about himself. He's saying, even me, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. See, Jesus is saying that true leadership in God's family, true spiritual leadership, is not about being the boss. It's not about authority. It's not about power. It's about servanthood. It's about putting the needs of others, those that are being led, first, and taking responsibility for what's best for those that are being led. Now, remember I said that they wanted to be on Jesus' left and right, and Jesus said, that's not for you to decide? I wonder if a little while later, when Jesus was hanging on the cross, and John was standing there at the foot of that cross with Jesus' mother Mary and some of the other women, if John looked up and he saw Jesus there, and he realized that that was actually Jesus' greatest moment of leadership and authority, giving his life for us, the ultimate act of servant leadership. And by the way, there was a criminal on either side. There were people on either side of him as Jesus was taking that ultimate step of servant leadership. I wonder if it occurred to John what he had really been asking. See, Jesus says that leadership in the church isn't about being a boss. Leadership in the church is about giving of yourself for the sake of others. It's about service. Now, the Bible has something else to say about leadership within the church. And that's this. This is in Hebrews chapter 13. It says this. It says, obey your spiritual leaders and do what they say. Their work is to watch over your souls, and they are accountable to God. So we do have leaders in the church, not only just pastors, but other staff, other lay leaders who are called to lead in God's family, who God chooses to lead in God's family. And God says that they have an important role, and people should listen to their leaders. But it also says this, it says that they have an accountability before God. That's a big responsibility, isn't it? When you're called to lead in God's family, you're called to be the kind of servant leader that Jesus was, but you're also called knowing that you're accountable to God for the spiritual lives and well-being and growth of the people underneath you. Now, praise God that Jesus' love and grace extend to leaders too, because leaders often fail. So leaders are not only leaders who serve, leaders that are accountable, but finally, and here's the one I want to make sure you hear loudly and clearly this week, God expects all of us to be leaders in his family. Now, right before Jesus ascended into heaven, he gathered together his disciples on a mountainside, and he called them together to tell them that he had a job for them, that they were to be disciples who make disciples. He said, go and make disciples. You disciples? Make disciples. See, that's what leadership in the church is all about as well. It's about helping people be more like Jesus, helping people be disciples. And he didn't just call a few of his disciples, special ones of his disciples, to those leadership positions. He called us all to it. Now, that doesn't mean we're all supposed to be pastors or full-time church workers or have positions of leadership like be on the governing board or things like that in the church. But it does mean that each and every Christian, each and every one of us, has the opportunity and the ability through God's Spirit working in us to lead at least one other person to Jesus. We're to be disciples that make disciples. Now, I want to tell you one last leadership story in God's family that I experienced in my life. Fresh out of college, I was a Lutheran school teacher, and I was teaching in junior high in a Lutheran school, and honestly, I wasn't going to church every Sunday. I kind of gotten out of the habit while I was in college, and I'd go some, but not every week. And One day, a couple months into the school year, my pastor, my spiritual leader there in that church, was a man by the name of Pastor Reardance, and he invited me to stop in his office after school that day. And I thought he was a big Cub fan like I was. I thought maybe he wanted to talk about the Cubs or something like that. And I went to his office. He said, "Hey, grab a seat, Mark." And I sat down, and he looked at me and he said this. He said, "Mark, I got a question for you." He goes, "What kind of example do you think you're setting for the students in your classroom by not being in church every Sunday?" He was holding me accountable. It's what leaders do. And he was doing it because he knew what was best for me. Now, I got to tell you, I didn't react great. I had a lot of excuses, and honestly, I was a little angry. Sometimes it hurts when you get held accountable. But inside, I knew he was right. And I started coming to church every week. But I always just felt a little bad about that conversation. And I got to be honest with you, there was a little, "You're not the boss of me." That little boy, there was a little of that in me too. And one other day, I went to stop in Pastor Rudance's office to see him for a minute after school, talk about something else. And I walked into his office. The door was open, but he wasn't behind his desk. And so I turned to start to leave, and I noticed over in the corner of his office there was a little kneeler, and he was kneeling there, and he was praying. And he heard me in the office, and he stopped, and he stood up and said, hey, Mark, what can I do for you?" And I said, "Well, what were you doing?" And he goes, I was praying." He said, I keep a church directory over there, and every day I go over there and I get on my knees before the Lord, and I open that directory and I work my way through it. And when I get to the end, I work my way back through it again and just pray for all the people that God has called me to lead." Folks, that's servant leadership. And my prayer is that I'd be that kind of leader. And my prayer for each and every one of us is that we would all be that kind of leader. Leaders sometimes have to say tough things to people and hold people accountable, but they're always doing it out of that servant heart for the best of those they lead. So here's my prayer for you, that first of all, that you would respect your leaders, your small group leader, your site pastor, the leaders here at our church, that you'd listen to them, that you'd understand that they lead with your best interests at heart, that you'd pray for them, that you'd encourage them, that you'd let them hold you accountable. But my prayer is also for you that you would never forget that God has called you to be a leader too. Who is that person that God is calling you to lead so that they can grow more like Jesus? May God bless us as we continue to be part of this church family, and as that tide of God's love and grace rises, that we would all rise together in his family. Amen.